America tells itself a simple story, that it is safe, that its cities cannot burn, its presidents cannot be taken, its buildings cannot fall, and its citizens cannot be left stranded by their own government. For most of the 20th century, that story held together. Americans woke up every morning believing that whatever was happening in the rest of the world, it was not happening here. But that story has been shattered over and over again by single days that changed the country forever. A Sunday morning in Hawaii, a Friday afternoon in Dallas, a Tuesday morning in New York. A hurricane nobody in power was ready for. Each one ended one version of America and started a new one, often uglier and more fearful than the one before it. Today, we are covering 10 devastating events that changed the United States forever. What you are about to hear will show you exactly how fragile the idea of an untouchable America has always been. Section 1. Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack that pulled America into World War II. It was a Sunday morning in Hawaii, December 7, 1941. The sun had just come up over the island of Oahu. The sky was clear, and most of the sailors at the U.S. Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor were still asleep, eating breakfast, or getting ready for church. The American battleships were lined up in a neat row along the southeast side of Ford Island, a small piece of land sitting in the middle of the harbor. The Navy called it Battleship Row. 7 of the mighty ships were anchored close together there, and the 8th, the USS Pennsylvania, was in a nearby dry dock for repairs. Nobody on those ships had any idea that a massive Japanese strike force was already sending planes toward them from about 230 miles north. Japan and the United States had been on a collision course for years. Japan had been at war with China since 1937 and wanted to expand across Asia. America did not like it. The U.S. cut off trade with Japan, froze Japanese money held in American banks, and stopped selling Japan the oil it needed to run its military. At the time, 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. Japan was running out of fuel, and Japanese leaders decided they had 2 choices: back down or go to war. They chose war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto came up with a bold plan: wipe out the American Pacific Fleet in one surprise attack, so America could not stop Japan from taking over Asia before the Americans could rebuild. The Japanese strike force left port in secret in late November 1941. 6 aircraft carriers, screened by a fleet of around 67 ships in total, crossed 3,000 miles of open ocean without being seen. At 6:10 in the morning Hawaiian time, the first wave of Japanese planes took off from those carriers. A little before 7 a.m., 2 American soldiers watching a radar screen on Oahu spotted a huge group of aircraft heading straight for the island. They told a junior officer. He told them not to worry about it. He thought they were American B-17 bombers that were supposed to arrive from California that morning. They were not. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese bombs started falling. The American base was caught completely unprepared. Torpedo planes flew so low they were only about 50 feet above the water when they dropped their torpedoes at the battleships. Other planes strafed the airfields with machine gun fire and dropped bombs on the rows of American planes, which had been parked wingtip to wingtip on the ground to protect them from sabotage, a decision that now meant they all got destroyed together. Within the first 5 minutes, 4 battleships had already been hit. The USS West Virginia sank fast. The USS Oklahoma rolled completely upside down and sank. Then, at about 8:10 a.m., an armor-piercing bomb hit the USS Arizona and reached a storage room holding more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder. The ship blew apart. 1,177 sailors, officers, and Marines on board the Arizona were lost in that single moment. More than half of all the Americans who died at Pearl Harbor that day died on that one ship. A second wave of 167 Japanese planes arrived around 8:50 a.m. By the time the Japanese planes turned around and flew back to their carriers, it was only about 10 o'clock. In less than 90 minutes, the United States had lost or suffered serious damage to roughly 19 warships, including all 8 of the battleships in the harbor. About 188 American planes had been destroyed. The total number of Americans killed was 2,403. 68 of them were civilians. Another 1,178 people were wounded. Japan lost 29 planes. But Japan missed 3 important things. First, the 3 American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that morning. They were out at sea. Those carriers would become the backbone of the American fightback in the Pacific over the next 4 years. Second, the Japanese did not destroy the huge fuel storage tanks on the base. Third, they did not destroy the repair shops and dry docks. That meant the Americans could patch up most of their damaged ships and put them back into service. The next day, December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood in front of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. He called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress agreed within an hour. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. Just like that, America was in World War II. Pearl Harbor did not just drag America into a war, it ended a whole way of thinking. Before that morning, most Americans wanted nothing to do with the problems of Europe or Asia. The country had spent the 1920s and 1930s trying to stay out of foreign fights. From that day on, the United States would never again be a country that sat out the world's big conflicts. Factories that had been making cars started building tanks. Women by the millions went to work because the men were gone. The country that came out of World War II in 1945 was a global superpower, with the atomic bomb and a permanent military footprint stretching across the world. Pearl Harbor was the moment America learned it was not untouchable. But it was not the only time a single morning would shatter that belief. Decades later, another surprise attack would test the country in a completely different way. This time not in uniform, not in a harbor, but in the heart of one of America's most famous cities. Section 2. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the day America lost its innocence. It was a bright Friday afternoon in Dallas, Texas, November 22, 1963. President John F. Kennedy had flown in that morning with his wife Jacqueline on Air Force One. He was 46 years old, the youngest man ever elected president, and at that moment, one of the most popular leaders in the world. He had come to Texas to patch up a political fight inside the Democratic Party and to quietly begin his run for a second term in the 1964 election. His wife sat next to him in a pink suit. In the car in front of them sat Governor John Connally of Texas and his wife Nellie. The car was a 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible. The top was off. It was a warm day, and the president wanted to see the people, and the people wanted to see him. An estimated 200,000 Americans lined the 10-mile route from the airport into the heart of downtown Dallas. The car turned from Houston Street onto Elm Street and entered a wide-open area called Dealey Plaza. Behind them, on the corner, stood a tall brick building called the Texas School Book Depository. On the 6th floor of that building, crouched in a window on the southeast corner, a 24-year-old man named Lee Harvey Oswald was waiting with a rifle. Oswald had lived a strange life. He was a former United States Marine. He had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, lived in the city of Minsk for 2.5 years, married a Russian woman named Marina, and then come back to the United States in 1962. He was angry, restless, and obsessed with politics. In March 1963, he had ordered a cheap Italian Carcano rifle through the mail for about $21 using a fake name. In October 1963, a neighbor helped his wife find him a temporary job at the Texas School Book Depository. He started work there on October 16th. Nobody knew who he really was. He made $1.25 an hour filling book orders. On the morning of November 22nd, he walked into the building carrying a long package wrapped in brown paper. He told a co-worker it was curtain rods. It was the rifle. At about 12:30 in the afternoon, as the presidential car passed below his window, Oswald fired 3 shots. The first shot missed. The second shot hit the president in the upper back, passed through his throat, and continued on into Governor Connally, wounding him in the shoulder, wrist, and thigh. The third shot struck the president in the head. Jacqueline Kennedy climbed onto the back of the car in shock. The limousine sped off to Parkland Memorial Hospital less than 4 miles away. Doctors tried to save him, but the head wound was too severe. At 1 p.m. Central Time, President Kennedy was officially declared dead. Oswald slipped out of the building and walked away. About 45 minutes after the shooting, a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippett stopped him on a street because he roughly matched a description being broadcast on the radio. Oswald shot Officer Tippett in front of several witnesses and kept running. He ducked into a nearby movie theater called the Texas Theater without paying for a ticket. An employee called the police. At 1:50 p.m., officers arrested him inside. At 2:38 p.m., on board Air Force One at Dallas Love Field Airport, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson placed his hand on a Catholic missal and took the oath of office. Jacqueline Kennedy stood next to him in her pink suit, still stained with her husband's blood. The body of the 35th president was already on the plane, waiting to fly home to Washington. Johnson was now the 36th. 2 days later, on Sunday morning, November 24th, the Dallas police were moving Oswald from the city jail to the county jail. A 52-year-old Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby slipped into the basement through a side ramp and, in front of television cameras broadcasting live across the country, stepped out of the crowd and shot Oswald with a revolver. Oswald died at the same hospital where Kennedy had died 2 days before. Ruby was arrested on the spot. The only man who could have answered the question of why was gone. That question has never stopped being asked. Later, the Warren Commission, set up by President Johnson, concluded after a 10-month investigation that Oswald acted alone and Ruby acted alone. Millions of Americans never believed it, and many still do not. On November 25, 1963, the country stopped to watch the funeral. Kennedy's flag-draped casket was pulled through the streets of Washington on a caisson drawn by 6 gray horses. His 3-year-old son, John Jr., on his own birthday, stood on the steps and saluted his father's coffin as it went by. That image became one of the most famous photographs in American history. Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with an eternal flame marking his grave. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Something bigger than a man died that weekend. Before Dallas, a lot of Americans still trusted that their country was safe, that their leaders were protected, and that their government told them the truth. After Dallas, trust in all three began to slowly crack. But the 1960s were not done. Less than 5 years later, another bullet would tear the country apart. Only this one would not be fired at a politician in a limousine. It would be aimed at a preacher standing on a motel balcony in Memphis. Section 3. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the night America's cities burned. It was just after 6 o'clock in the evening on April 4, 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped out of room 306 at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 39 years old. He had come to Memphis to support a strike by the city's black sanitation workers, who were fighting for better pay and safer working conditions after 2 of their co-workers had been crushed to death inside a garbage truck earlier that year. King was getting ready to head out to dinner. He was standing on the motel's second-floor balcony, leaning on the railing, talking down to his friends in the parking lot below. A photographer later captured what those last seconds looked like. It was an ordinary evening. He was calling to a musician named Ben Branch to remind him to play a certain song that night. Across the street, in the bathroom of a cheap rooming house at 422.5 South Main Street, a man named James Earl Ray was crouched inside a bathtub with a rifle. Ray was a 40-year-old career criminal. He had escaped from the Missouri State Penitentiary in April 1967 while serving a 20-year sentence for armed robbery. He had spent the last year on the run, moving through cities in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. He was also a racist. His own family later said he had spoken openly about wanting to kill Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4th, he had read in the Memphis newspaper that King was staying at the Lorraine Motel in room 306. He rented a room in the boarding house across the street under the fake name John Willard. He asked to switch to a room that had a view of the motel. He bought a pair of binoculars. Then, he waited. The bathroom down the hall from his room had a window that looked straight across at the motel balcony. He stood in the bathtub, propped his Remington .30-06 rifle on the window ledge, and waited for King to come outside. At 6:01 p.m., Ray fired one shot. The bullet traveled across the street, hit King in the right side of the face, and knocked him backwards onto the balcony floor. His friends ran to him. They pointed across the street to show the police where the shot had come from. Less than an hour later, at 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital in Memphis. Ray grabbed his things, ran out of the rooming house, and dumped a bundle containing the rifle, the binoculars, and his clothes on the sidewalk next to a nearby store. He jumped into a white Ford Mustang and drove south. He made it to Atlanta, abandoned the car, and then traveled to Canada. Over the next 2 months, he used a fake Canadian passport to fly to London, to Lisbon, and back to London again, trying to reach the white minority-ruled country of Rhodesia in southern Africa. On June 8, 1968, he was caught at London's Heathrow Airport as he tried to board a flight to Brussels. The FBI had run what was, at that point, the biggest and most expensive manhunt in the agency's history. He was extradited back to the United States. On March 10, 1969, his 41st birthday, Ray pleaded guilty to the assassination to avoid facing the electric chair. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He spent the rest of his life trying to take back that guilty plea. He died in prison in 1998. But while Ray was running, the country he had cut open was tearing itself apart. The news of King's death spread across America in hours. For millions of Black Americans, King had been the face of peaceful protest. He had led the movement that won the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He had preached nonviolence his entire adult life. And a white racist had shot him on a motel balcony for it. The grief turned into rage. Within hours, riots broke out in more than 100 American cities. Over the following week, the uprisings spread across the country. By the time the fires died down, around 27,000 people had been arrested, roughly 3,500 were injured, and more than 40 people were dead. Washington, D.C. alone saw more than 1,200 fires and about $24 million in property damage. In Chicago, 11 people were killed and around 125 fires burned. In Baltimore, more than 5,000 federal troops had to be sent in to patrol the streets. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. President Lyndon Johnson was so shaken by what was happening that he made a hard push to pass the Fair Housing Act, a civil rights bill that King himself had spent years fighting for. Congress passed it on April 10th. Johnson signed it on April 11th, one day after King was buried in his hometown of Atlanta. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets and watched his casket get pulled through the city on a simple wooden farm cart drawn by 2 mules at his own request. It was the last major piece of civil rights legislation of the era, but the damage was already done. The peaceful movement King had built started to splinter. Cities that burned in April 1968 lost thousands of jobs, watched property values collapse, and never fully recovered. White flight to the suburbs sped up. Politicians who ran on law and order started winning elections across the country. The civil rights movement, as most Americans had known it, was over. By the end of the 1960s, America felt broken. Its leaders were being gunned down, its cities were on fire, and its streets were full of angry young people. Something else had been quietly building for years, too, something that had nothing to do with bullets or riots, but would put millions of Americans out of work. Section 4. The Wall Street Crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, the 10 years that broke America. For most of the 1920s, America felt unstoppable. The decade was called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. Cars, radios, and electric appliances filled American homes for the first time. Jazz was everywhere. Ordinary people, not just the rich, were buying shares in the stock market and watching their money grow every single month. Between August 1921 and September 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed from 63 points to 381.17. That is a 6-fold jump in 8 years. Everyone who put money in seemed to get rich. Chauffeurs, cooks, school teachers, and office clerks were all playing the market, many of them for the very first time. A famous economist named Irving Fisher said just before the crash that stock prices had reached what looked like a permanently high plateau. Almost nobody thought it could end. But a lot of that money was fake. Most of the people buying stocks were not using their own cash. They were buying on something called margin, which meant they put down only 10% of the stock's price and borrowed the other 90% from a stockbroker. The broker then borrowed from a bank. The whole system was built on stacks of debt piled on top of each other. As long as prices kept going up, everyone was happy. But if prices ever started falling, those loans would get called in, and people would have to sell everything fast to pay them back. The first cracks showed up in September 1929. Then, on Thursday, October 24th, the whole thing started to come apart. Panic selling hit the New York Stock Exchange. A record 12.9 million shares were traded in a single day. That day is still called Black Thursday. A group of the biggest bankers in America pooled their money and rushed in to buy giant blocks of stock at high prices, the same trick that had worked during an earlier financial scare in 1907. It seemed to calm things down. On Friday and Saturday, the market looked steady. Then Monday came. On October 28th, known as Black Monday, the Dow crashed by nearly 13% in a single day. The next day was worse. On Tuesday, October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, 16.4 million shares were traded. The Dow fell another 12%. Fortunes that had taken people decades to build were gone in hours. Real people, regular Americans, watched their entire life savings vanish by lunchtime. Some of the biggest names in industry were destroyed. General Electric fell from 396 points to 210. United States Steel dropped from 261 to 166. Radio Corporation of America crashed from 505 all the way down to 26. Newspapers the next morning ran headlines about the total wipeout on Wall Street. And the worst part was that the crash of October 1929 was not really the end. It was just the beginning. The Dow kept falling, on and off, for almost 3 more years. It finally bottomed out on July 8, 1932, at 41.22 points. That was an 89% drop from its peak. The market would not get back to its 1929 high until November of 1954, 25 years later. Once the stock market collapsed, it dragged everything else down with it. People stopped buying cars and furniture and appliances. Factories cut back on what they were making. They fired workers. Those workers then could not afford to buy anything either, so more factories cut back. The economy was eating itself. By 1930, about 4 million Americans were out of work. By 1931, that number was 6 million. By 1933, nearly 15 million Americans had lost their jobs, which was roughly 25% of the entire workforce. 1 in 4 adults who wanted to work could not find anything. The banks were even worse hit. When depositors got scared, they ran to pull their money out, and most banks did not have enough cash on hand to cover everyone at once. Around 4,000 banks failed over the next few years. When a bank failed, whatever money ordinary people had saved inside it was simply gone. There was no insurance. The life savings of millions of American families just disappeared overnight. What followed was a decade of misery unlike anything the country had ever seen. Soup kitchens opened in every major city. Long lines of hungry men and women formed outside them each morning. Shanty towns made of cardboard and scrap wood popped up on the edges of towns. People called them Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, who most Americans blamed for doing too little. Farmers in the Midwest got hit twice, first by collapsing crop prices, and then by a massive drought that turned their fields into dust and blew the soil away in huge black storms. Hundreds of thousands of families packed everything they owned into beat-up cars and drove west to California looking for any kind of work. In 1932, Americans voted Hoover out and put Franklin D. Roosevelt in the White House. Roosevelt launched what he called the New Deal. He created Social Security, so older Americans would never have to live out their final years in poverty. He created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation so that a bank failure could never wipe out someone's savings again. He created the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate Wall Street and make the kind of reckless margin trading that caused 1929 illegal. He created a minimum wage. He put millions of unemployed Americans to work building roads, bridges, dams, and schools that are still standing today. The Great Depression finally ended when America entered World War II in 1941. But the way Americans thought about their government, their banks, and their economy had been changed forever. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 10 years of hunger and bank runs had tested the country like nothing before. But a different kind of disaster had hit even earlier, One that came not from Wall Street, but from inside the lungs of almost a third of the population. Section 5. The 1918 influenza pandemic, the invisible killer that made October the deadliest month in American history. It started quietly. On the morning of March 4, 1918, a United States Army cook named Albert Gitchell walked into the infirmary at Camp Funston, an Army training base at Fort Riley, Kansas. He had a sore throat, a fever, and a headache. The doctor wrote down what he saw and sent Gitchell to bed. He was the first officially recorded case of what the world would later call the Spanish flu. By lunchtime that same day, another 107 soldiers had reported the same symptoms. Within a week, 500 men at Camp Funston were sick. Within 3 weeks, 48 of them were dead. Nobody in America knew what was coming. Camp Funston was one of dozens of Army training bases the United States had built in a hurry after entering World War I the previous year. Young men by the hundreds of thousands were shipping in, sleeping in tight rows of bunks, eating in crowded mess halls, and then shipping out to Europe on packed transport boats. By May 1918, about 1 million American soldiers had landed in France. They brought the virus with them. It tore through the armies of both sides on the Western Front. Then, it moved to every country the war touched. Because Spain was neutral in the war, Spanish newspapers were the only ones allowed to report freely on the outbreak. Every other country kept it quiet to protect wartime morale. So when the rest of the world heard about it, they thought it had started in Spain. The name Spanish flu stuck, even though the flu almost certainly did not come from Spain at all. The first wave in the spring of 1918 was bad but manageable. Most people recovered in about 3 days. Then, something happened over the summer. The virus mutated. When it came back to American shores in August and September, it was a completely different beast. This was not the kind of flu that gave you the sniffles for a week. This one could kill a healthy young adult in under 24 hours. People would go to work in the morning feeling fine and be dead by nightfall. Doctors had never seen anything like it. The virus attacked the lungs so violently that sufferers would drown in their own fluids. Their faces would turn blue from lack of oxygen. And there was one more thing that made it uniquely terrifying. Normal flu outbreaks mostly kill the very young and the very old. The 1918 flu did the opposite. About half of its American victims were between 20 and 40 years old. Healthy men and women in the prime of their lives. Mothers and fathers of young children. Soldiers returning home from the war. Nobody could figure out why. Then came the worst single moment in the American part of the story. On September 28, 1918, the city of Philadelphia went ahead with a massive parade called the 4th Liberty Loan Drive to raise money for the war. Around 200,000 people packed Broad Street for 2 miles, shoulder to shoulder, to watch marching bands, Boy Scouts, and troops parade past. Philadelphia's public health director, Wilmer Cruzen, had been warned by city doctors not to hold the event. He let it go ahead anyway. Within 72 hours, every bed in every hospital in Philadelphia was full. Within a week, 2,600 Philadelphians were dead. On the worst single day of that outbreak, 759 people in the city died. Funeral homes ran out of coffins. The city asked a trolley car manufacturer to build wooden crates to serve as makeshift ones. Bodies piled up in houses because there was nobody left to collect them. Drivers rolled carts through the streets shouting for families to bring out their dead. October 1918 became, and remains, the deadliest month in American history. Nearly 195,000 Americans died in those 31 days. Life in the country essentially stopped. Schools, churches, theaters, and saloons shut down in most major cities. San Francisco started fining anyone caught in public without a mask. St. Louis shut down everything early and ended up with a death rate about 1/8 of Philadelphia's. Courts in San Francisco held trials outside in public parks. The Red Cross begged for volunteer nurses because so many real nurses were overseas with the army or sick themselves. In some parts of Alaska, entire indigenous villages vanished. Bristol Bay lost 40% of its population. By the time the pandemic finally burned itself out in the summer of 1919 and trailed off into early 1920, the numbers were almost unbelievable. About 675,000 Americans had died. That was more American deaths than World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. American life expectancy dropped by 12 years in a single year. 28% of all Americans had been infected. Hundreds of thousands of American children had lost at least one parent. Worldwide, around 500 million people had caught it, which was roughly 1/3 of every human being alive at the time. Between 50 and 100 million were dead. And then, something strange happened. America moved on. Newspapers stopped writing about it. Families stopped talking about it. For most of the 20th century, the 1918 flu was almost completely forgotten, even in school history books. People who had lived through it buried it in silence. It took nearly a century and a new pandemic, COVID-19, for Americans to remember how close their grandparents and great-grandparents had come to being wiped out. Nature was not done reminding the country that its biggest enemies were sometimes things nobody could see. Decades later, 7 Americans would die not from a disease, but while live television cameras watched, inside a machine that was supposed to represent the very best America could build. Section 6. The Challenger Disaster. 73 seconds that shattered America's faith in progress. On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of American school children were sitting in their classrooms waiting for something amazing to happen. Their teachers had wheeled television sets into the rooms. NASA had set up live broadcasts in schools across the country because, for the very first time in history, a regular American school teacher was about to be launched into space. Her name was Krista McAuliffe. She was a 37-year-old social studies teacher at Concord High School in Concord, New Hampshire, a wife, a mother of 2 young children. She had beaten out more than 11,000 other teachers to win a seat on the Space Shuttle Challenger. She was supposed to teach 2 lessons from orbit. One was called The Ultimate Field Trip. The other was about why space travel mattered. Every kid in America knew her name. The mission was called STS-51L. It was the 25th flight of the Space Shuttle program, the 10th flight for Challenger, and it had already been delayed several times. The launch was originally set for January 22nd. Weather and technical problems pushed it to the 28th. The night before the launch, a brutal cold front swept through central Florida. Temperatures at the Kennedy Space Center dropped to around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Thick ice formed on the launch tower. Icicles hung from the metal beams. The Challenger had never been launched in weather anywhere near that cold. And that was the problem nobody outside of NASA knew about. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, had spent the night before the launch begging NASA not to fly. The boosters were sealed with rubber rings called O-rings, and the engineers had already figured out that those O-rings got stiff and did not seal properly in cold weather. They had certified the equipment only for launches above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Bob Ebeling, one of the engineers, would later say they were only qualified down to 40 degrees, nowhere near 18. In a late-night phone conference, the engineers formally recommended against launching. Their own managers overruled them. NASA managers, under pressure to keep the shuttle program running on schedule, decided to go ahead. The warnings never made it up the chain. The 7 people who would be strapped into that shuttle the next morning had no idea any of that had happened. The crew was called the most diverse ever flown. Commander Francis Scobie, known as Dick, was a veteran Air Force pilot. Pilot Michael Smith was a Navy test pilot. Mission specialists were Ellison Onizuka, the first Asian American in space, Judith Resnick, one of the first American women to fly in space, and Ronald McNair, the second African American in space. The 2 payload specialists were Gregory Jarvis, an engineer from Hughes Aircraft Company, and Krista McAuliffe. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 28, 1986, Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B. The first 72 seconds of the flight looked perfect. The shuttle rose over the Atlantic Ocean, trailing a long white plume. In classrooms around the country, children cheered. In the bleachers at Cape Canaveral, Krista McAuliffe's parents were looking up at the sky with huge smiles on their faces. Mission Control radioed up a routine instruction. "Challenger, go with throttle up." Commander Scobie replied, "Roger, go with throttle up." At 73 seconds after launch, at an altitude of about 46,000 feet, the shuttle broke apart. What most people saw on television looked like an explosion, a huge, forking cloud of white smoke splitting across the blue sky. The crowd at Cape Canaveral went silent. In classrooms, teachers hurried to switch off the televisions. On the launch pad announcer's loudspeaker, a flat voice read out the words. Obviously, a major malfunction. Then, the vehicle has exploded. What actually happened was not quite an explosion. A leak through one of those cold, stiffened O-rings in the right solid rocket booster had let burning gas escape. That gas burned into the huge external fuel tank. The tank ruptured. Challenger was torn apart by the aerodynamic forces, not a true blast. The crew cabin separated in one piece and continued coasting upward for several seconds before falling into the Atlantic Ocean. Investigators later found that several of the crew's emergency air packs had been manually switched on. At least 3 of the astronauts were alive and conscious for at least part of the 2.5-minute fall. All 7 were lost when the cabin hit the water. President Ronald Reagan had been scheduled to give his State of the Union address that night. He postponed it and spoke to the country from the Oval Office instead. He told American children that sometimes painful things like this happen, that it is part of exploring, and that the crew had slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. Reagan appointed a presidential commission led by former Secretary of State William Rogers, with former astronaut Neil Armstrong and test pilot Chuck Yeager on the panel. Their investigation was brutal. They exposed that NASA had known about the O-ring problem for years and ignored engineer warnings. The entire shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. NASA did not fly another astronaut until September 1988. The agency created a new Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance. The Teacher in Space program was quietly canceled in 1990. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For a generation of Americans, this was the first time they had ever seen something go terribly wrong in real time on live television. But 9 years later, another live broadcast would fill American screens again. This time, not from a rocket in the sky, but from the smoking remains of a federal building in the middle of Oklahoma. Section 7. The Oklahoma City bombing. The morning a homegrown attack changed what Americans feared. At 9:02 a.m. on the morning of April 19, 1995, The front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City was sheared off in a single second. The 9-story government building was filled with ordinary people just starting their workday. Parents had dropped off their kids at the daycare on the second floor only a few minutes earlier. Workers were at their desks with their morning coffee. Then, a rented yellow Ryder truck parked out front, which had been left there a few minutes before by a man who had calmly walked away, detonated. The bomb inside it weighed about 4,800 pounds. It was made of regular farm fertilizer soaked in diesel fuel and other chemicals. It was the deadliest act of homegrown terrorism in American history. The blast destroyed about a third of the building. Entire floors pancaked straight down on top of each other. More than 300 other buildings in a 48-square-block area of downtown Oklahoma City were damaged or destroyed. 86 cars were incinerated. Shock waves from the explosion were felt 55 miles away. When the dust settled, 168 people were gone. 19 of them were children, most of them under the age of 6, who had been in the America's Kids Daycare Center on the second floor. More than 680 people were injured. 30 children were left without a mother or father. Another 219 lost at least one parent. A nurse named Rebecca Anderson ran into the rubble to help the wounded, was hit on the head by falling debris, and died a few days later, becoming the 169th loss. At first, the whole country assumed this had to be the work of Middle Eastern terrorists. Cable news reporters went on air speculating about foreign attackers. For 2 days, Muslim Americans across the country were harassed and threatened over something they had absolutely nothing to do with. Then the FBI released a sketch of the man who had rented the Ryder truck in Junction City, Kansas. And the truth turned out to be something America had barely thought about until that week. The man who did this was a 26-year-old white United States Army veteran from upstate New York named Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh had served in the Army during the Gulf War in 1991 and earned several medals. But after being discharged, he had drifted into the world of far-right anti-government thinking. He was obsessed with 2 specific events. The first was a 1992 standoff between federal agents and a survivalist named Randy Weaver at his cabin in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, in which Weaver's wife and son were killed. The second was the 1993 siege at the Branch Davidian religious compound in Waco, Texas, where about 76 people died on April 19, 1993, when the 51-day standoff ended in a huge fire. McVeigh had driven down to Waco during the siege and handed out anti-government leaflets. After Waco, something inside him broke. He came to believe the federal government was at war with its own people and that somebody had to strike back. He teamed up with a former Army friend named Terry Nichols, who was 13 years older and shared his views. Together, over the course of a year, they planned the attack. They picked the Murrah building because it housed the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the very agency that had started the Waco raid. They picked April 19th specifically because it was the 2nd anniversary of the Waco fire. McVeigh carried pages from a racist novel called The Turner Diaries with him in the truck that morning. The book describes white supremacists using a truck bomb to blow up the FBI headquarters at 9:15 in the morning. McVeigh detonated his bomb 13 minutes earlier. And then he got caught, by almost pure luck. Only 90 minutes after the blast, about 75 miles north of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma State Trooper Charlie Hanger pulled over an old yellow Mercury sedan on the highway. The reason he pulled it over was simple. The car had no license plate. The driver was Timothy McVeigh. When Trooper Hanger noticed a bulge under McVeigh's jacket, McVeigh told him he had a loaded gun. He was arrested on the spot for illegal weapons possession. He was sitting in an Oklahoma jail cell on an unrelated charge while the FBI was still putting together the sketch of him. Terry Nichols turned himself in 2 days later. The FBI investigation became the biggest in the agency's history up to that point. Agents conducted more than 28,000 interviews and reviewed nearly 1 billion pieces of information. McVeigh was convicted in 1997 and executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001, the first federal execution in the United States since 1963. Terry Nichols was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A third man, Michael Fortier, had known about the plot and served about 10 years. The bombing changed the country in ways that are still being felt. The FBI hired 500 new agents specifically to track domestic extremist groups. Federal buildings all over the country were redesigned with concrete barriers and setbacks. The word terrorism, which most Americans had only ever associated with people from faraway places, suddenly had an American face. On the site of the Murrah Building now stands the Oklahoma City National Memorial, with a field of 168 empty bronze chairs, one for every person lost, 19 of them smaller than the rest. But the worst terrorist attack in American history was not Oklahoma City. Exactly 6 years, 4 months, and 23 days after that April morning, 4 airplanes would turn into something nobody had ever imagined they could be. Section 8. The Columbine High School Tragedy. The day that changed what it feels like to go to school in America. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, 2 seniors at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, pulled into the school parking lot in separate cars. They were 17 and 18 years old. Their names were Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris. They had been students at Columbine for years. They had friends. They went to prom. They held down part-time jobs at a local pizza place. Nobody around them had any idea that the two of them had been quietly planning for more than a year to carry out the worst attack on an American high school that the country had ever seen. What they walked into the school carrying was not originally meant to be a school shooting at all. In their journals, which investigators later recovered, Klebold and Harris had drawn up a plan to bomb the school cafeteria during the busiest lunch period. They had built 2 large homemade propane bombs out of tanks, pipe bombs, and aerosol canisters, and hidden them inside duffel bags on the cafeteria floor. They had set the bombs to go off at 11:17 a.m., when they believed as many as 500 students would be inside eating lunch. They had then planned to wait outside and shoot anyone who ran out of the building. If their plan had worked the way they wrote it down, the death toll could have been in the hundreds. But the bombs did not go off. Something in the wiring failed. So, around 11:19 a.m., when it became clear the cafeteria bombs were not going to explode, the 2 teenagers went with their backup plan. They pulled out guns they had hidden under long black trench coats and walked toward the school. For the next 47 minutes, Columbine High turned into a scene nobody in America was ready for. Across the school, teachers scrambled to herd students into classrooms and lock the doors. Teacher Dave Sanders, a 47-year-old computer teacher and coach, ran through the hallways warning students to hide and get to safety. He was shot, and despite the efforts of students who tried to save him for hours inside a locked classroom while they waited for help to arrive, became the only staff member lost that day. Most of the other victims were in the school library, where dozens of students had hidden under tables. By about 12:08 p.m., Klebold and Harris ended the attack by taking their own lives inside the library. In total, 12 students and 1 teacher were lost that day. 21 more people were wounded by gunfire. 3 others were injured while trying to escape. In 2025, a 14th victim, Anne-Marie Hochhalter, died from long-term complications of the paralysis she suffered in the attack. Her death was formally ruled a homicide, making her the latest and final official victim of what happened on April 20th, 1999. The police response became a source of serious criticism for years afterward. Following the protocol of the time, police did not enter the school building right away. They set up a perimeter and waited for SWAT teams to arrive. SWAT teams entered 47 minutes after the shooting started. It took about 5 hours before the school was declared fully under control. Some wounded victims waited inside the school for hours before help reached them. One of the biggest changes to come out of Columbine was a complete rewrite of how police respond to active shooter situations across the country. The new rule became simple. The first officers on the scene go in immediately, no matter how few of them there are. That new approach has been credited with saving lives in nearly every mass shooting response since. But the bigger change was what happened to American schools themselves. Before Columbine, most American students had never heard of a lockdown drill. Within a few years of the attack, almost every school in the country was running them. Kids as young as kindergarten age now learn how to hide under desks, how to barricade classroom doors, and how to stay silent if a gunman is in the hallway. Schools installed metal detectors, security cameras, and single entry points with armed school resource officers. According to one estimate given by President Joe Biden on the 25th anniversary of the attack in 2024, more than 400 school shootings have taken place in the United States since Columbine, exposing more than 370,000 American students to gun violence on school grounds. Columbine also gave birth to something researchers now call the Columbine effect. Because the attack was televised live, and because the shooters became infamous, dozens of later school attackers openly said they had studied the Klebold and Harris plan and wanted to copy it. More than 70 copycat attacks around the world have been directly tied to Columbine. Over 300 deaths have been attributed to those copycats. Virginia Tech in 2007, Sandy Hook Elementary in 2012, Parkland in 2018, Uvalde in 2022. Each one began in a place that was supposed to be safe. Each one ended with a list of names. The original Columbine High School building was partially renovated after the attack, but the library, where so many students lost their lives, was torn down and replaced with an open atrium. The Columbine Memorial opened in Clement Park next to the school in 2007. Families of the students still visit it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 years later, in a different state and on a different kind of morning, the country would witness something that made even Columbine feel small. Section 9. The September 11th Attacks. The morning America stopped feeling safe. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, started out as one of the most ordinary mornings imaginable in the United States. The weather on the East Coast was perfect. Clear blue sky, no clouds, a light breeze. It was a primary election day in New York City, and polls had just opened. Kids were in school. Adults were commuting to work. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan stood 110 stories tall, one of the most recognizable sights in the world, and every morning, about 17,000 people went to work inside them. At 8 a.m. that morning, most of them were already at their desks. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 took off from Logan International Airport in Boston, bound for Los Angeles. There were 81 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board. At 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 took off from the same Boston airport, also heading to Los Angeles, with 56 passengers, 9 crew members, and 5 hijackers. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Washington Dulles International Airport with 58 passengers, 6 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board. And at 8:42 a.m., after a 42-minute delay on the runway, United Airlines Flight 93 took off from Newark International Airport for San Francisco with 37 passengers, 7 crew members, and 4 hijackers. 4 planes, 19 men working for an extremist group called Al-Qaeda, led by a Saudi exile named Osama bin Laden, who had been hiding in Afghanistan for years. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center between the 93rd and 99th floors. The plane was traveling at roughly 466 miles per hour and was loaded with about 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. The impact cut off every stairwell above the 91st floor, trapping hundreds of people in the upper section of the tower. At first, most Americans who saw the footage assumed it was a terrible accident. Some kind of small plane or helicopter must have lost its way. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 came out of the southern sky and struck the south tower between the 77th and 85th floors. The collision was captured on live television. Millions of Americans were watching. In that moment, everyone understood that this was not an accident. President George W. Bush was visiting Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida that morning. At 9:05 a.m., his Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, leaned down and quietly whispered in his ear that a second plane had hit the World Trade Center and that America was under attack. The president was in a classroom full of children. He kept reading to them for a few more minutes to avoid causing a panic before he left. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 flew straight into the western side of the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States military just outside Washington, D.C. A fireball ripped through 5 floors of the building. Everyone on board and 125 people inside the Pentagon were lost. At 9:45 a.m., the Federal Aviation Administration took the unheard-of step of shutting down all air traffic over the continental United States. More than 4,500 planes that were in the air were ordered to land at the nearest airport immediately. One plane was still in the air. United Flight 93 had been hijacked over northern Ohio around 9:28 a.m. But the passengers on this plane had something nobody else had gotten: time. Because of the delay at takeoff, by the time the hijackers turned the plane around and pointed it toward Washington, D.C., the passengers were able to use airphones and cell phones to call their families. They learned that planes had already hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. They realized they were not going to be released. They took a vote, and then, around 9:57 a.m., they rushed the cockpit. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 plowed into an empty field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, about 20 minutes of flying time from its intended target, believed to be the United States Capitol building. Every one of the 40 passengers and crew on board was lost. But they had saved whatever that plane had been meant to destroy. Back in New York, the unthinkable happened. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed to the ground in about 10 seconds, 56 minutes after being hit. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. Both buildings, 110 stories each, were gone. A thick gray cloud of dust and debris poured through the streets of Lower Manhattan and swallowed everything for blocks. Later that afternoon, a third building at the World Trade Center complex, known as 7 World Trade Center, also collapsed from fire damage. When the smoke finally cleared, 2,977 people had been lost, not counting the 19 hijackers. 2,750 of them died in New York, 184 at the Pentagon, 40 in a Pennsylvania field. More than 400 New York City police officers and firefighters were among them, men and women who had run into the towers trying to save strangers. The America that woke up on September 12th was a completely different country. Within a month, the United States was at war in Afghanistan. The Patriot Act was signed into law 6 weeks later, giving the government sweeping new surveillance powers. The Department of Homeland Security was created. The Transportation Security Administration took over every airport in the country. The wars that followed would last longer than any in American history. Just 4 years after that September morning, another disaster would reveal a very different kind of breakdown in America. This one caused not by enemies from abroad, but by wind, water, and a government that was not ready. Section 10. Hurricane Katrina, the storm that drowned a city and exposed America. On Friday, August 26, 2005, a storm called Katrina was spinning in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and growing fast. Weather forecasters could already see it was going to be huge. By Sunday, August 28th, Katrina had exploded into a Category 5 hurricane, with peak sustained winds of 175 miles per hour, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the Atlantic. That same morning, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin did something the city had never done in its entire history. He ordered a mandatory evacuation. Get out, he told everybody, and get out now. An estimated 1.2 million people from the greater New Orleans area did. But somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 people stayed behind. Many of them simply had no way out. They had no car, no money for gas, no family outside the city to go to, and no bus tickets being offered to them. The city opened the massive Louisiana Superdome, the home of the New Orleans Saints, as a refuge of last resort. About 10,000 people walked in with whatever they could carry. New Orleans is a city built in a bowl. Much of it sits below sea level. Two big bodies of water, Lake Pontchartrain to the north and the Mississippi River to the south, are held back by a 350-mile system of levees and flood walls originally built by the Army Corps of Engineers. That system had been designed only for hurricanes up to Category 3, and although the project had been meant to be finished decades earlier, by 2005, it was still only 60 to 90% complete. Everyone in the city knew the levees might not hold against a really big storm. They had known for years. Katrina made landfall near Burris, Louisiana at 6:10 a.m. on Monday, August 29, 2005, as a strong Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds of 125 miles per hour. It pounded the Gulf Coast for hours. Along the Mississippi coastline, a storm surge of up to 28 feet above normal tide levels flattened towns like Gulfport and Biloxi. Entire beachfront neighborhoods were simply wiped off the map. Mississippi alone would lose 238 people. And then came the worst part. During the storm and into the next day, the levee system around New Orleans failed. Not in one place, but in more than 50 places across the city. 3 major flood walls collapsed at the 17th Street Canal, the Industrial Canal, and the London Avenue Canal. Investigators later found that some of the walls had not been overtopped by water at all. They had failed because of engineering flaws in how they were built. Water poured into the city for hours. By Tuesday, August 30th, about 80% of New Orleans was underwater. Some neighborhoods were under 15 feet of water. People climbed into their attics. People chopped holes through their roofs with axes and sat on top of their houses, waving sheets and towels to signal for help that took days to arrive. The lower Ninth Ward, a historic black neighborhood, was hit so hard by the flood wall break that entire houses were shoved off their foundations and swept away. Inside the Superdome, conditions were turning into a nightmare. 2 sections of the roof had been peeled off during the storm. The generators flooded, the air conditioning failed, the toilets stopped working. The population of the Superdome doubled within 2 days as helicopters dropped off thousands more people pulled off their rooftops. By September 1st, about 30,000 people were stuck inside the stadium in 90-degree heat with almost no food or clean water. Another 25,000 were at the nearby New Orleans Convention Center, which had never been set up as a shelter at all. 6 people were confirmed lost at the Superdome itself during that week. The federal response was devastatingly slow. Cameras from every major news network were already broadcasting scenes of stranded Americans begging for water, while the federal government seemed unable to get anything moving. FEMA Director Michael Brown was publicly praised by President George W. Bush in those early days, even as the agency struggled to deliver basic supplies. Brown resigned 18 days after the storm hit. It wasn't until September 2nd, 4 full days after landfall, that a serious military relief effort fully arrived in New Orleans. By that point, Americans across the country and around the world were watching and asking a very hard question. Why had their government left its own citizens stuck on rooftops for days? The final numbers were crushing. More than 1,800 people were lost across the Gulf Coast. The damage was later estimated at around $160 billion, making Katrina the costliest natural disaster in American history at the time. Over 1 million people were displaced, the largest American displacement since the Great Depression. The city of New Orleans lost more than half of its population after the storm. Some neighborhoods, like parts of the lower Ninth Ward, are still not fully rebuilt 20 years later. The country's reaction forced major change. Congress passed the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act in 2006, which rebuilt FEMA from the inside out and gave the agency clearer authority. The federal government spent $14.5 billion rebuilding the New Orleans levee system into something far stronger, now designed to survive a 100-year storm. Katrina also forced the country into a painful conversation about race, poverty, and who gets left behind when a disaster hits. More than half of the Louisiana residents lost to the storm were black, in a state where black residents were a minority. Every event covered in these stories, from Pearl Harbor to Katrina, left the country different from how it found it. Some of those changes were written into laws. Some were written into the skylines of cities. But all of them were written, forever, into what it means to be American. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.